Hello, BookTube. Recently, Michael K. Vaughan did a video that I found fascinating. I'll leave it linked down below on the subject of canon and whether or not it matters. Canon in literature and whether or not it matters. And when you think about it, if you know Michael K. Vaughan's channel, and I'm assuming if you watch my channel that you do, questions about canon and the legitimacy of canon are going to be at the heart of a large amount of his reading experience. Not all of it. A lot of people forget that he reads widely, but I think it's safe to say that his favorite reading is absolutely plagued when it comes to questions of canon. Because his favorite author is Robert E. Howard. And that leads to a lot of trouble when it comes to canon, because Robert E. Howard not only recut and reshaped his own stories for the pulps in any way, like raw garments in a tailor shop, and also died before he could really think of his own personal canon in those terms, or that anyone would think of it in those terms. But also, the still warm corpse of his corpus of writing was battened on right away by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, who brought out books with Robert E. Howard's name on them that were full of stuff that Robert E. Howard didn't write, or doctored stuff that he did write, pasted and repasted in places and orders and arrangements that he did not agree to and might not have liked. And for a huge number of people, for a whole generation of readers, those books were Conan. Naturally, this would be the stuff of nightmares to someone like Michael K. Vaughan. But his video range is wider on the subject. I want to do a response video and range on that myself because I find it fascinating. And one of the reasons that it is fascinating is because of the nature of so much of our popular entertainment in the last, let's say, 100 years. Let's say since Robert E. Howard was writing. And that is how much of our pop culture is collaborative. You don't get issues of canon, any legitimate issues of canon, with a work. You used to not get legitimate issues of canon with a work that was simply and unambiguously the work of one person. So right around the same time as Robert E. Howard was churning out Conan stories that were going to be bastardized and changed and amalgamated by other authors immediately after his death, right around the same time that he was doing that, another Michael K. Vaughan favorite, Edgar Rice Burroughs, was also writing books, many of which also involved an immortal fictional character. Not every writer gets to write an immortal fictional character. Most of them don't. Robert E. Howard only lived to 30. He wrote one, King Conan. He wrote Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Barbarian is an immortal character. Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote Tarzan, an even more immortal character. But Edgar Rice Burroughs kept firm control over what he was doing. Absolutely ironclad control. And set up his literary estate so that it would do likewise when he had shuffled off this mortal coil. And as a result, there is absolutely no question of canon when it comes to the Tarzan novels, for instance, or Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter novels, or his Carson Napier novels, or whatever. There's no question of Edgar Rice Burroughs' canon at all. And I want to say that the difference is collaborative. And in a way, I think that's true. I mean, no one would argue, I would not argue, that there's anything collaborative in Robert E. Howard's genius when it comes to his pure, iconic Conan stories. But there was a collaborative attitude about the pulps. It's understandable to me. I'm one of the few people that looks at what L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter does now in the 21st century. I'm one of the few people that looks back on that and does not simply vilify those two, and Bjorn Nyberg. I'm one of the only people who doesn't simply vilify them. I think that's a little anachronistic. I don't think that's how a lot of people thought about stuff that was born in the pulps back when they did that. It was, I read this story. Do stories in pulps even have authors? Now, people who know the history of the pulps really well will tell you that, of course, is not true. Pulp readers were very vocal about reading a particular story by a particular author and wanting more from that particular author. But nevertheless, you get other iconic figures like the Spider or the Shadow or Doc Savage that were definitely part of the churn it out factory fiction of the time. Think of Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. It was fairly well known in publishing circles right then, which is, again, around the same time. It was fairly well known in publishing circles that the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys stories and other stories were written by a whole room of people, not by any one person. You couldn't write a Hardy Boys story and publish it yourself, because that whole room of people were guarded by a whole room of lawyers. You would hear from them right away if you did. But nevertheless, canon became a little fuzzy when it came to that. You got the impression back then that The Shadow, for instance, didn't really have one author. And that blurred in with the form of pop culture that was ascendant at the time and would become a multi-billion-dollar industry by going to the cinema, and that is comic books. Another favorite subject between Michael K. Vaughan and myself, comic books. What is canon in a comic book? Who can even say that? No one can. The writers who write these characters, Superman or Wonder Woman or Thor or Spider-Man, they don't have any ownership over what they're doing. They can't claim it. It's a corporate thing. And therefore, the canonical events of those characters have changed drastically over decades and then changed back. So when you get an Avengers movie, well, what do you do with that? What do you do with the canonicity of an Avengers movie? It's pretty muddy. It's pretty blurry. Same thing would also be true with two other absolute tentpole franchises of our pop culture, which are also, believe it or not, collaborative. One started out, neither one of them seems collaborative when you immediately think of them. I'm talking, of course, about Star Trek and Star Wars. Star Trek, you immediately think Gene Roddenberry. Star Wars, you immediately think George Lucas. But Gene Roddenberry was a presiding spirit over the original Star Trek. He was also a presiding spirit in some ways over the beginning of the Next Generation, and his spirit, not himself, but his vision of the future was definitely a presiding spirit for the showrunners of all of the classic Roddenberry era Trek, even the shows that started after he was dead. But there were a lot of other people involved, and there were a lot of other voices in it. He wasn't exercising anything like the scene-by-scene, sentence-by-sentence, micromanaging, psychotic control that George Lucas was. So Roddenberry might have an idea of what Vulcan society was like, but he's perfectly willing to let Dorothy Fontana write that and come up with it on her own. As a result, what's canon for Star Trek has always, rather frustratingly, been what's on the screen, not what's in any kind of literature. Star Trek was born on the screen, so what's on the screen is canon. And I say that's problematic because you don't know who's going to get to run that. What's canon on the screen? Okay, fine. In the original Star Trek, you have the Vulcans, you have the Romulans, you have the Klingons. And there's not a whole lot done with them. DC Fontana did a lot with the Vulcans. Efforts were made to show occasionally three-dimensional Klingon characters. A couple of times, with a couple of good character actors brought on to do that. And we have two actually great episodes that show you'll pardon the phrase, human Romulan. Two great episodes to show that, but it's not much. The original Star Trek didn't run long enough. And there wasn't the idea of world building anyway. And then you had the Next Generation that was still canon. It was still the Roddenberry era Star Trek, but it's elaborating on all of those things and subtly changing some of them. And those subtle changes continue with Deep Space Nine and Voyager and even Enterprise, even Star Trek Enterprise. But what do you do if somebody else takes control? So you've had a polite gentleman's agreement about what canon is. What if somebody else takes control? What if Alex Kurtzman takes control and he's just given a free rein, where the studio says, we don't have any movies in the works, so do whatever you like. Nobody cares about this stuff. It's bug-eyed monster stuff. We don't care. We care about money. That's all we care about is money. Literally money. That's all we care about is money. We don't care about our children. Don't care about our wives. Don't care about our mistresses. Don't care about our illicit relationships with the pool boy. We just care about money. That's it. We'd eat money if we could. So go ahead. Do whatever you want. And what's the result? a beloved young character from Star Trek Voyager, Icheb. We see him in Star Trek Picard get tortured to death and have one of his eyes ripped out of his head. And it's on screen, so it's canon. And that's to say nothing of all the other atrocities that have happened. Mike mentions one of them in his video because he can't let go of Strange New Worlds. And I understand. Star Trek Strange New Worlds is arguably the most popular Kurtzman Trek show. It is certainly the most beautiful Kurtzman Trek show. And it's an absolute travesty. It's the Battle of Stalingrad to Roddenberry continuity. So when you're watching Strange New Worlds, you're thinking, what is canon? What on earth am I supposed to do with canon? Same thing with Star Wars. George Lucas exercised a megalomaniac control over Star Wars, but he allowed it to expand enormously. Not necessarily the movies, but the books. The books were micromanaged by him and his team into a vast and amazingly cohesive, expanded universe. It's amazing how many Star Wars novels there are, first of all, and how many of them were made to cohere with each other. Almost to the point where you need to read them all to read any of them towards the end, where you need to read them all to understand them. I remember reading a Star Wars novel late in that whole process, where I forget the name of it. It involved two side characters, one of whom was a Jedi, and I was reading it and thinking, okay, why did you, the author, just devote 31 pages to this little detail? Why did you do that? It doesn't have anything to do with the plot of the book. And I feel like I'm reading a foreign language. I feel like, why did you do that? It's my job to understand books and why authors make the decisions they do. And I don't understand this at all. I had to go online to find out that the explanation for those 31 pages was contained in a different novel. That's how interlocked the Star Wars expanded universe was. And then George Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney. He even filmed the moment. Why he would do that, I have no idea. He filmed the moment of signing away his signature creation for money. Signing away Star Wars for money. We're not talking about him doing this in 1979. He did this when he knew that Star Wars was a cultural icon, that it was a part of American culture, world culture. He knew that, and he signed it away for money. And I don't think I need to elaborate much on what Disney has done with Star Wars since then. In terms of canonicity, though, it's as important as Icheb getting his eye ripped out. It is important as Star Trek Picard spending 2 seasons having Captain Jean-Luc Picard, one of the grandest and most stately starship captains of them all, grovel an apology to literally everyone he's ever dealt with. Everything that I did in The Next Generation, I apologize for. It was all wrong because I'm a man. If we're going to talk about canonicity when it comes to that show, well, then we have to talk about canonicity when it comes to Star Wars, because Kathleen Kennedy and her colleagues dismissed the extended universe. They said, we're not bound by this at all. We don't care about any of it. And substituted for it something much, much, much worse, including thoroughly debasing the 3 main characters from George Lucas's Star Wars. Princess Leia is turned into a laughingstock from one particular scene that is so patently ridiculous that not even the most loyal fan can look at it and do anything but giggle. And Carrie Fisher then promptly died. You don't get a chance to fix that. Han Solo is revealed to be a loser. Thinks he peaked at the prom. Thinks he peaked in high school. And who is then casually and pointlessly brochetted by his son to no end at all. I'm just going to splice you and that's it. That's all. And worst of all, Luke Skywalker, the hero of George Lucas's Star Wars, who is revealed to have done something to a blood relative of his that is worse than anything that Darth Vader did to him. And then fades away like a bad dream. He never gets to redeem himself, never gets to do anything. And also, thanks to the explicit direction of Kathleen Kennedy, the explicit rule for these new movies, these new Star Wars movies, was that those 3 characters could never share a scene together. Do not give the fans what they want. Do not do it. In fact, give them what you know they'll hate. And that's all on the screen. Now, Star Wars started with a book, and also on screen, and in comics, and then a whole flood of books after that. So are those things canon? Star Wars fans have to grapple with the idea of canon. They have to wonder, in a way that Edgar Rice Burroughs fans do not have to worry about canon. Anything that isn't in the Edgar Rice Burroughs books is not canon. There's never been a question about that. Tarzan has been adapted for the screen. Tarzan has had a ton of great comic book stories. No one even thinks about them. You like them? Sure, I do. I've seen them all and I've liked them all. But they're not. You never have a question if they're canon. They are pastiche. They are firmly pastiche. Same thing with Sherlock Holmes. You know what's canon with Sherlock Holmes. That's it. You know what's canon. It's what Arthur Conan Doyle wrote. Everything else is pastiche. All of it. No matter what. No matter how much you would like it to be otherwise. I remember once I was working in a bookstore, and a know-it-all, a pretentious customer came up and wanted to know if I had the Sherlock Holmes story where Holmes re-teams up with Irene Adler with the help of Sigmund Freud. It's in a later story. I patiently told this customer, well, it's in a later story, yes, but it's not a Conan Doyle story. It's not a canon story. It was done by Nicholas Meyer for his movie, The 7% Solution, and his novel, The 7% Solution. The customer said, oh, no, it's canon. And, I can let him go his own way, but I don't need to think about it. There is no doubt. Whereas, if someone were to say a certain event in Darth Vader's life was canon, well, before Disney bought Star Wars from its creator, you might have had a case because that event would have happened in one of those extended universe novels, not contradicted by any other extended universe novel, and with George Lucas's explicit approval. Never occurred on the screen, but you could have called it canon. Now, can you? Well, you see what I mean. When you get to something like a collaboration, when you get to something where there's any doubt as to whether or not other people get to claim that something is canon, you're in an awful murky position. And Star Trek and Star Wars fans are in that kind of a position now. Comic book fans are in that kind of a position now, definitely. If you're a comic book fan, almost certainly, I know there are stubborn holdouts, but almost you won't. If you're not a comic book fan, you won't know what I'm about to talk about. I will only talk about it briefly. But if you are a comic book fan, specifically an X-Men fan, except for a few stubborn holdouts, I think you will say the Krakoa storyline is not canon. Now, comic book fans will know what I mean. Maybe some of you disagree, but I've never met a comic book fan, an X-Men fan, who would not instantly have said that. Yeah, it's not canon. Of course it's not canon. No. Some writer's going to have to come along and say this didn't actually happen, or that it happened under extenuating circumstances, but none of these characters are these characters, so no, none of this happened. But comic books are explicitly collaborative, so you can say that, but someone else can say otherwise. And that wishy-washy nature, that wishy-washy nature of canon arises from collaborative exercises. That's where it comes from. Not anywhere else. Everywhere else, you can just firmly say, well, if you say this is canon, you're wrong. Like that pretentious customer, you can just say, well, you're wrong. You can think whatever you like, but you're wrong. This only has one creator, and everything else that follows is pastiche. But when it comes to collaborative stuff, you really can't say that. Not with assurance. You can say, these characters are acting out of character. I don't like this. This doesn't seem like something this character would do. You can say that a lot with Strange New Worlds. But you can't 100% plant your flag. And that has led to something in connection with canon and canonicity in pop culture that I hate. That it didn't really get much of a mention in Mike's video, but boy, oh boy, did it come up in the comments to his video. It's a concept that I absolutely hate, and yet I can't avoid it, and I also can't completely delegitimize it. And that is the concept of a headcanon. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. That is when fans say, well, I'm deciding what's canon and what's not in my head. Privately, for me, this is canon and that is not. The only way that you can come up with a concept like headcanon is in collaborative works. So if I want to say, I hear this would make Mike squirm just a bit, but if I want to say that Bill Sankovich's The Shadow, Blood and Thunder The events where Lamont Cranston comes to the modern world decades after he was the Shadow in the 30s. If I want to say that's part of my headcanon for the Shadow, I can. A number of people wrote the Shadow. No one has ever established a firm canon. So I guess I could. I could say that's my headcanon. But I don't like the concept. The concept very much is a 21st century concept where I will decide what my reality is, and then I will just live in that reality. And I hate that. I hate it wherever it occurs. Even when, as in the case of headcanon with collaborative literature, it's kind of sort of justified. It's certainly, you can't dismiss it. Every one of us has been tempted to do that. Every one of us has been tempted to say, well, I'm just going to pretend that this isn't happening. I'm just going to pretend that Kurtzman Trek, for instance, didn't happen. This isn't real Star Trek. How many times have you heard that? This isn't real Star Trek. This isn't real Star Wars. How many times have you heard that? This isn't real Star Trek. None of these characters are acting the way they would. This completely destroys the continuity of all the Star Trek that I grew up loving. And it looks like it was made to do that for ideological reasons, so I'm just going to ignore all of this. None of this is canon for me. Have you been forced to do that? Where do you stand on the subject of canon? Would you agree with me that it really does only apply to things that don't have one aggressively territorial author? If only Gene Roddenberry had been a little more territorial, I don't know how he could have done it. Especially not when the franchise took off and there were multiple shows. I don't know how he could have done it. And if only George Lucas had stayed territorial instead of selling Star Wars. Maybe we wouldn't be having quite so much of this kind of discussion. But it crops up all the time anyway with studio properties. Was the last Terminator movie canon? Terminator was born on the big screen. Was it canon? Is the next Predator movie, the one that's coming out, is that going to be canon? Even though it's going to be a travesty, you're going to hate it. Is it canon? I want to hear your thoughts on the subject. What do you do with problem canon? Unfortunately, we don't have this problem with everything. A lot of things that we love, we don't have this problem with. There's no question of Jane Austen canon, for instance. But what do you do when it's something that you love? What do you do with the problem of canon? What do you do essentially when your collaborative plastic pop culture thing is handed like a Christmas present to a barbarian, to a Visigoth, someone who wants to deface it and invert it and destroy it and mock it? What do you do when that happens? What happens with your mental view of the canon of that thing when that happens? I want to hear it. Of course, I want to hear it. Tell me all. Go and watch Mike's video and leave comments for him as well. This is a great subject. What do we all do with canon? I love it. So anyway, I'll wrap this up. Just a response video, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.